You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
Hello, and thank you for joining the American Revolution. This week, episode 394, Tennessee joins the Union. On June 1st, 1796, President George Washington signed the law formally admitting Tennessee as the 16th state to join the Union. This week, we'll take a look at how Tennessee got there. We last looked in on this region in episode 335. At that time, the western colonies of North Carolina were sick of the abuse they were getting from the rest of the state, and they declared themselves to be the independent state of Franklin. North Carolina had already agreed to cede this land to the Continental Congress in 1784, but Congress had refused to accept it. To the residents, that meant they felt free to form their own state and applied to Congress for recognition. Now, between 1784 and 1788, the state of Franklin operated independently of North Carolina. It elected Revolutionary War hero John Sevier as its president. The government continued to work with the Confederation Congress to gain recognition, and it made treaties with Indian tribes to justify its land claims. North Carolina officials declared the Franklin movement to be a revolt and an act of treason against the state. At the same time, North Carolina officials did not have the money to suppress the rebellion militarily, so it focused on political compromise. It offered pardons to any citizens of Franklin who returned their allegiance to North Carolina. It also authorized continued elections in those western counties, which permitted the Loyalists who wanted to remain with North Carolina to elect representatives to the North Carolina legislature. North Carolina essentially sought to divide Franklin by establishing local leaders that supported the view that they should remain part of North Carolina. Very quickly, John Tipton assumed a leadership role in that area. Tipton had originally been a part of the movement to form the independent state of Franklin. He was also a political rival of Sevier. When the Franklin legislature unanimously elected Sevier as president, and Tipton could not even get a seat in the legislature, he took great offense. He was further disenchanted when the state constitution he supported, which favored strict religious requirements and morality laws, was rejected in favor of a constitution that was simply a modified version of the North Carolina Constitution. Tipton saw his dream for the new state and his role in the leadership disappear. In the Loyalist election run by the North Carolina government in August of 1786, Tipton won election as a representative from the western counties to the North Carolina legislature. Tipton became a leading advocate for crushing the state of Franklin and keeping the western counties within the state of North Carolina. For the next 2 years, people living in this disputed territory were subject to two different governments that conflicted with one another. There were two sets of militia, two court systems, and two separate demands for the payment of taxes. The situation became so dire that in 1787, Sevier and General Evan Shelby had to reach a temporary understanding that residents would not be forced to pay taxes to one jurisdiction if they had already paid taxes to the other. Now, this agreement was only a temporary one to prevent an all-out civil war between the two groups. At the same time, North Carolina Governor Richard Caswell, who had been friends with Sevier, promised that if the Franklin movement ended its efforts at independence, North Carolina would allow a peaceful separation under its own terms at a later date. North Carolina also encouraged Franklin supporters to jump ship by promising to forgive the years of back taxes that were due to North Carolina if they would abandon the movement. These conciliatory efforts, along with North Carolina's ability to isolate Franklin economically, resulted in the movement losing some support. Franklin's government began to collapse in late 1787. Officials feared holding an election because it would almost certainly result in a contest of arms that would leave many dead. When President Sevier's term ended in March of 1788, there was no legislature in place to replace him and no infrastructure to hold a new election. So with that, the Franklin government simply collapsed and the state largely faded away. Sevier, however, and other small numbers of men refused to give up. In February 1788, just before Sevier's term ended, and while Sevier was trying to make agreements with local Indian tribes, Tipton had the North Carolina sheriff raid Severe's plantation and seize his slaves for non-payment of North Carolina taxes. When Severe returned, he discovered that his slaves were at Tipton's plantation. He rounded up about 150 men to take back his property by force. His men surrounded the plantation, but Tipton refused to concede. Severe's men outnumbered the 15 defenders by about 10 to 1. They even brought up a small field cannon to force the surrender. Tipton, as I said, refused to back down. He dared the attackers to fire. Severe could not follow through on his threat. He was not ready to massacre Tipton and kick off a larger war, which he would almost certainly lose. So Severe's men besieged the plantation for a few days. They did take some pot shots at a few defenders who stepped outside the house. They ended up killing one and wounding another. Finally, a relief force arrived, scattering Severe's army and capturing their cannon. 2 of Severe's sons were captured following the retreat. Tipton threatened to hang both of them, but backed down after they pleaded for mercy. Despite this incident, things seemed to be returning to unity, with North Carolina largely back in control. Governor Caswell's policy of persuasion had an impact, but North Carolina replaced him with Governor Samuel Johnston. According to most sources, Johnston was not particularly interested in frontier issues. As a colonial legislator, he had sponsored legislation to punish the Western colonists who had rebelled at Alamance long before the war. Those advising him, including Tipton, advised the governor that Severe remained a threat to North Carolina. Severe had reached an understanding with the North Carolina militia commander, Evan Shelby, but even Shelby ended up being replaced by Joseph Martin, who very much wanted to use force to crush the Franklin movement. Martin convinced Governor Johnston that this was the right policy. He suggested that Severe was incorrigible and would never settle. He asserted that Severe had killed a Cherokee chief and was on the brink of inviting a larger Cherokee war against the region, and that he might be raising a Western army to attack North Carolina directly. Now, none of these accusations seemed to have much basis in fact, but they were enough for Governor Johnston to order Severe's arrest for high treason. Johnston issued the order in July of 1788. Severe at the time was leading an army, but one that was fighting off attacks from the Cherokee and Chickamauga warriors on the frontier. When Severe returned home in the fall, Tipton formed a posse and cornered Severe at the home of a friend and arrested him. He placed Severe in handcuffs and brought him to Morgantown. Along the way, one of the guards informed Severe that one of the other guards planned to murder him. Severe tried to make an escape, but his horse got tangled in the underbrush. The guard that was determined to kill Severe, a man named French, caught up with Severe, pulled his pistol, and shot Severe in the head. Fortunately, the ball had fallen out of the pistol before it was fired, leaving Severe only with a bad powder burn. The posse delivered Severe to the sheriff of Burke County. Severe, however, still had a loyal following. Word of his arrest resulted in 2,000 men picking up their arms and riding to rescue Severe. The army assembled at Jonesboro. Those commanding the volunteer force, including Severe's sons, met to debate how to proceed best. One of the officers, Major James Cosby, suggested that the best way to rescue Severe was not with a large army, but rather a small group of men who could conduct a jailbreak. Cosby handpicked 5 other men, all of whom were officers who had served under Severe during the Revolutionary War and in the Indian Wars. By the time the men arrived in Morgantown, the treason trial against Severe had already begun. Thousands of people surrounded the courthouse as spectators. Cosby left 4 of the men and their horses on the outskirts of town. He and Captain Nathaniel Evans rode into town, made their way up to the courtroom door, bringing Severe's horse with them. Cosby just walked into the courtroom, made eye contact with Severe, and made sure that Severe saw his horse standing by the courthouse door. Cosby then shouted at the judge, creating a distraction. Severe took that moment to dash for the door, jump on his horse, and ride off at a full gallop. During the confusion, Cosby and Evans also managed to get back to their horses and ride away. Although the sheriff's deputies gave chase, they were unable to catch anyone. Part of this success may have been due to the fact that most of the anti-Severe advocates, including Tipton and Martin, had already gone into hiding. Severe's capture had brought on threats by mobs to lynch these men. Therefore, people who probably could have identified Severe's friends and who had an inclination to do so were not at the trial. And despite his escape, Severe was a wanted fugitive from the law, but his popularity remained so high among the people in the western counties that it soon became apparent that officials needed to come to some accommodation with him. While on the run from the law, the voters elected Severe to the North Carolina State Senate. In November 1789, Severe showed up at the Capitol, demanding to take his seat. Other representatives, including Tipton, objected to seating a wanted fugitive. Severe was so popular, though, that debate turned to a resolution to withdraw the charges against him and restore his rights of citizenship. Debate on the matter grew so intense that Tipton attempted to strangle one of Severe's advocates on the House floor. Others broke up the fight, but soon a duel was planned for the two men, but the matter actually got settled before the actual duel occurred. The resolution passed, and Severe took his seat. This was not the end of his redemption. Shortly afterward, Militia General Martin submitted a claim for a militia campaign against the Chickamauga. By tradition, the Western militia had defended themselves against the Indians and had borne their own costs. So the legislature was so offended by this claim for expenses that they removed Martin as Brigadier General of the Western Militia. In his place, they appointed, guess who? John Sevier. So in a matter of days, Sevier had gone from being a wanted criminal and a target of the militia to being their new commander. The following year, Sevier left the state legislature. North Carolina had finally ratified the Constitution. The voters of Western North Carolina elected Sevier to the U.S. House of Representatives and sent him off to Congress. While in Congress, Sevier helped to arrange North Carolina's second attempt to cede Western lands to the federal government, and this time it was more successful. Congress accepted the land cession and established the Southwest Territory in the spring of 1790. President Washington appointed William Blount as governor of the Southwest Territory. I mentioned Blount a few weeks ago as one of the speculators who got caught up in the effort to buy the Yazoo lands of western Georgia. Blount had also been active in the movement to get North Carolina to ratify the Constitution. After Blount lost his bid to become one of North Carolina's first U.S. senators, President Washington offered him the governorship of the Southwest Territory, which is what essentially became Tennessee. This was in thanks for his efforts in bringing North Carolina into the Union. Western settlers were initially skeptical of Blount, who was from eastern North Carolina, but Blount made friends with Sevier, who still held the trust of the Westerners. Blount also tried to appoint Tipton as a justice of the peace, but Tipton refused the appointment. Blount made efforts to end the feud between Sevier and Tipton. At one point, he actually convinced Tipton to burn a petition that he had been circulating to discredit Sevier, but the two men really never got past their differences. Much of Blount's efforts, however, were focused on peace with the Indians. In 1791, he managed to get an agreement to the Treaty of Holston with the Cherokee, establishing which lands were reserved for Indians and which were open for settlement. The area that became the Southwest Territory already had 7 counties: Washington County, Sullivan, Greene, Davidson, Sumner, Hawkins, and Tennessee counties. As territorial governor, Blount created 2 more counties in 1792. Knox County was named for his superior, Secretary of War Henry Knox, and also Jefferson County. Both of these were set on lands acquired through the Treaty of Holston. In October, Blount established the territorial capital at a fort along the Tennessee River in Knox County. That town became known as Knoxville. Under the rules set by Congress for the territory, it would first be controlled by the governor, a secretary, and 3 federal judges, all appointed by the President of the United States. Once the population reached 5,000 qualified voters, they would establish a territorial legislature. To vote, one had to be a free white male, at least 21 years old, and with at least 50 acres of land. A 1791 census showed over 6,000 qualified voters, but Governor Blount delayed establishing a legislature for over 2 years. Blount wanted to consolidate his own power in the territory and perhaps put himself in a better position to enrich himself with Western land grants. He argued that the delay was over the lack of taxes to support a legislature, but this led to pushback from the people. The territory finally held its first elections in late 1793, leading to a territorial legislature being seated in February of 1794. Under territorial rules, the people elected a House of Representatives. The House then nominated 10 men to form a legislative council, essentially an upper house. President Washington would select 5 of those 10 men to serve in that upper house. Among those selected for the Legislative Council was John Sevier. The legislature also elected a territorial non-voting delegate to represent the territory in the U.S. Congress. The legislature got to work quickly forming Sevier County in 1794 and Blount County in 1795. They also chartered 3 colleges: Blount College, which eventually became the College of Tennessee, Greenville College, and Washington College. They also set up a territorial tax code, setting the maximum land tax at 12.5 cents per 100 acres. They also authorized public lotteries for special government projects. For statehood in the Northwest Ordinance, a territory needed 60,000 free inhabitants before applying for statehood, and people assumed the same rule would apply to the Southwest Territory. By 1795, the legislature called on Governor Blount to conduct a census. The results of the census revealed in November a free population of over 66,000 people, plus another 10,000 slaves. The legislature promptly called for a constitutional convention to meet in Knoxville in January of 1796. Each of the 11 counties sent 5 delegates, for a total of 55 delegates, at the convention. They chose Blount to serve as convention chairman. Interestingly, Sevier did not serve as a delegate to the convention. The main purpose of the convention was to write a constitution. There was some debate about whether to have a single-house legislature or a bicameral legislature, that is, 2 houses. They chose the latter. There was also considerable debate over religious tests for office. The original proposal required all office holders to believe in the, quote, divine authority of the Old and New Testaments. This ended up getting removed and replaced with a prohibition on anyone holding office who denied the existence of God. On the other hand, they also excluded ministers from serving in the state legislature. Another important provision mandated that all land be taxed at the same rate, based on acreage, not value. This was a huge boon to land speculators who held particularly valuable parcels of land. Another issue came up because of a significant portion of the population who operated farms on Indian lands. Since they could not officially own this land, they could not serve since they were not landowners. The delegates added a special exception to allow these people to serve in office. Voting, however, removed all land ownership requirements. Any free adult male who resided in the state for at least 6 months was free to vote. Voting was open to both black men and white men, as long as they were free. One of the more controversial debates over what might happen if the federal government refused their application for admission to the Union. Now remember, the whole state of Franklin controversy happened when North Carolina had tried to cede this territory before. Congress rejected taking it, and that's when the population formed the state of Franklin. One delegate proposed that they make clear that they would exist as an independent state whether or not the federal government allowed them to join the Union. This, of course, revived fears of a whole new State of Franklin Part 2 controversy, where the people would once again be fighting the rest of the country for their own independence. The response to this was that the federal government had already taken control of the territory. It gave every indication that it was ready to include them in the Union, and there was no need to provoke controversy unless some rejection actually happened. The majority of delegates voted to table the question and just move on to other things. However, the preamble of the Constitution that they drafted did make clear that the people, quote, do mutually agree with each other to form themselves into a free and independent state. One other decision that the convention had to decide was what to call the new state. They avoided calling it Franklin, mostly out of concern that it would dredge up again those divisions that had plagued the region for the last decade. A young lawyer at the convention, named Andrew Jackson, suggested they call the state Tennessee, named after the Tennessee River, which in turn took its name from the Cherokee town of Tanasi. The main problem with the name was that there was already a Tennessee county. That county agreed to change its name and give the name to the new state. When the convention ended on February 6, 1796, the process moved pretty quickly. Governor Blount forwarded the state constitution to Secretary of State Timothy Pickering. Without waiting for any response, the Tennessee General Assembly convened its first session at the end of March. President Washington forwarded the Constitution and the application for statehood to Congress on April 8th. Congress, of course, had its concerns. The main concern was political. Federalists were concerned that Tennessee would vote for Thomas Jefferson in the upcoming presidential elections later that year, potentially harming John Adams' chances of winning. Some of them argued that the census was rigged and that Tennessee didn't really have a free population of 60,000 people. Some argued the territory should be divided into two states, which would have greatly delayed the process since each of those two states would have to develop a population of 60,000. After about a month of debate in Congress, the House of Representatives passed a bill approving admission by a vote of 43 to 30. The matter then went to the Senate, which promptly voted against admission. The two houses worked out a deal which granted admission, but also reduced Tennessee's initial House delegation from 2 to 1 person until the 1800 census. This also had the effect of giving the state one less electoral vote for the next two presidential elections. But with that change, the Senate withdrew its objections to statehood, and the bill passed on May 31st. The next day, June 1st, President Washington signed the admission bill, formally admitting Tennessee into the Union as the 16th state. Next week, George Washington gives his farewell address. Hey, thanks for joining the American Revolution Podcast After Show, part of the Airwave Media Network. Thanks to my Patreon supporters in the Alexander Hamilton Club, George Davis and Gordon Kemp, and thanks to Robert Morris Circle supporter Jason Guggens. Also, thanks to Scott Edens for a generous one-time gift via PayPal, and John Collins for a one-time gift on Venmo. Really do appreciate everyone who helps to support this podcast. Finally, I want to give a shout out to John Schultz and thank him for sending me a couple of t-shirts from his new store, Founding Bully. You can check out Founding Bully on his Etsy page. Now, before we get to this week's episode, I want to mention that I received an opportunity from a travel company to put together an American Revolution tour. I would be the host and would have a few other interesting speakers and tour guides to show a select group around several battlefields and historical sites. We're thinking about a tour in the fall of 2027 that would center around Boston and Philadelphia with a number of stops in between. The tour would probably be limited to around 20 people and would last over a week. If this sounds interesting to you, please let me know. I want to know not only whether you're interested in going on the tour, but the details of what you think we should include in the tour and what's most important to you. I want to gauge interest, of course, to see if we have enough people to make the tour a success, and I'll be posting an online survey soon to get your input, although you're also just free to email me. As I said, all of this is still kind of taking shape. It's just an idea we have, and we want to see if there's enough interest in a tour and what to include. So if you have any thoughts on this, let me know. This week we covered Tennessee's path to becoming the 16th state to join the Union. As I mentioned at the end of the main episode, Tennessee got started as a state even before Congress acted on its petition. This upset some members of Congress, since this was a federal territory and Tennessee was not a state until they said so. Sevier remained the most popular political leader in the new state. The legislature elected him as governor, and he would go on to serve 6 two-year terms as governor. Blount, who had been a reasonably popular territorial governor, did not even try to contest the election with Sevier. Instead, he sought and received one of the state's first appointments to the U.S. Senate, along with William Koch, who had been the territory's non-voting delegate to Congress. Blount would end up not even finishing his term in office. A few years later, he would be accused of a conspiracy to help Britain take control of Spanish-controlled Louisiana and Florida, and when this was exposed, the Senate expelled him from his seat. He faced criminal charges and tried to flee, only to be recaptured. The House impeached him, but the Senate refused to convict since senators determined that House and Senate members were not subject to impeachment under the Constitution. Impeachment is only for members of the executive and judiciary. Blount returned to Tennessee, where he remained popular. He was elected to the state Senate and became Speaker of the Senate. He died in an epidemic in 1800. Tennessee's single House seat went to Andrew Jackson, who had been a prosecutor and the U.S. District Attorney for the territory. Jackson was also a loyal supporter of William Blount and had married into the powerful Donaldson family. As a result, he won his election without any opposition. Jackson, of course, would go on to much bigger things. Tennessee's haste to get the government started would end up coming back to bite them. Congress refused to seat its senators and representatives because members held that they had been elected before Congress said that they were really a state. So Tennessee had to go back and hold new elections, which had the same result. As expected, Tennessee did vote for Jefferson for president in both 1796 and again in 1800. However, its votes, even if it had had that extra electoral vote, would not have had an impact on the outcome. Tipton, who had been the enemy of statehood in Franklin years, managed to get elected to the State House. Even though Tipton had nearly gone to war with Sevier and had tried to have Sevier hanged as a traitor, Governor Sevier appointed Tipton as a magistrate for Washington County and a commissioner for the town of Jonesboro. Despite these appointments, Tipton would remain a fierce rival of Sevier, using his position in the state legislature to investigate some of Sevier's land deals for corruption. Tipton ended up retiring from politics in 1799, but still remained a fierce critic of Sevier his whole life. Tipton's great-nephew, also named John Tipton, would become a U.S. Senator from Indiana. My book recommendation this week is Tennessee, A Short History by Stanley Folmsbeck, Robert Corlew, and Enoch Mitchell. I'm guessing this was written as a book for college students. It covers the entire history of the state, so there's only 4 or 5 chapters on the area we covered in this episode, but it gives good coverage of that area. This book is an older one, published in 1969, but if it sounds interesting to you, get Tennessee, A Short History by Folmsbeck, Corlew, and Mitchell. My online recommendation is an older book called The History of Tennessee by William Garrett and Albert Goodpasture. This also appears to be a college textbook covering all of Tennessee history, but there was less history to cover since the book was published in 1900. Again, this is thorough coverage of the early history of Tennessee, but this book is in the public domain and is available for download on archive.org. As always, I've included links on my blog and in the show notes. My question this week asks, if you could have one conversation with any Revolutionary War figure, who would it be and what would you ask? Now first, let me say that I've probably given way too much thought to this question. I guess I find this question to be a tricky one since my answer would probably depend on whether I could count on genuine answers to my questions. For example, if I had a conversation with George Washington, we know he was notoriously formal with most people and took almost no one into his confidence. So in a conversation with him, I'd probably get rather guarded answers and probably annoy him by pressing for further details. I'd also, for example, like to ask Benedict Arnold why he abandoned the cause and betrayed his country. But again, I'm not sure I'd really get a genuine answer from him. I'd get something that would probably be kissing up to the British government where he was at the time. Someone like, say, Benjamin Franklin was a brilliant conversationalist and could speak on a variety of interesting topics. I guess my biggest fear with him is that he would likely turn the tables on me and start asking questions to me, especially if I could answer questions about the future of science and other advances that the country had seen. Many of the founders, especially someone like John Adams, were particularly concerned about how history would view them, so I would have a concern there that they would be speaking to somebody that they knew would be writing history, would probably result in explanations that were self-promoting, exaggerating their roles while minimizing their faults. So, after all these caveats and thoughts, I suppose my answer would be that I would want a person who had the combination of knowledge and personality that would produce the most interesting conversation. And for that, I'd probably have to go with Thomas Jefferson. He was widely understood to be a fascinating conversationalist, especially in small groups, and he could speak at length on just about any topic. Now, since I've spent much of my life focused on First Amendment issues, I'd really like to understand more about how he conceived the importance of free speech and freedom of religion, and how he might apply those principles to many of the issues that have ended up dividing lawmakers in later centuries. The other thing that would be kind of interesting to ask of any number of the founders in 1776 would be to get a candid response to what they really thought their chances were of winning independence, how they thought the war was going to go, how long it would take to win, if they did win, and did they think it was important to fight even if there was a good chance of losing. It really is easy to look back with our hindsight, but the perspective of people at the beginning of the fight would really be interesting to me. If you have a question you'd like me to answer, please reach out to me either via email or on X, Facebook, Quora, or Reddit. Well, that's all for this week. I hope you will join me again next week for another American Revolution podcast.